to be affected are passions that reduce it to a minimum and cut us off from our essence or our power of action. Yet there appears in this pessimistic assessment of existence a first glimmer of hope. The radical distinction of action and power science should not lead us to overlook a prior distinction between two kinds of passions. Any passion does of course keep us cut off from our power of action, but this to a greater or less.
Okay, in this video we're going to be looking at chapter 17, or listening to chapter 17 as I read along in Deleuze's book on Spinoza called Expressionism in Philosophy. So we can just get started with that. Let me make sure I've still got that on the screen. Chapter 17, that's where we are. Probably we're going to be starting with the second paragraph here. Yet there appears, and woohoo, like that. Alright, so kind of like that, I believe. Okay.
Any passion does of course keep us cut off from our power of action, but this to a greater or lesser extent. As long as we are affected by passions, we have not come into full possession of our power of action. But joyful passions lead us closer to this power. That is, increase or help it. Sad passions distance us from it. That is, diminish or hinder it. The primary question of the ethics is thus, what must we do in order to be affected by a maximum of joyful passions? Nature does not favor us in this respect, but we should rely on the effort.
You'll notice too that there's a lot of problems with the reading. It's going to, especially on numbers, and here it'll spell out these by each letter, and in a lot of cases the word joyful, it'll get hung up and say J-O-Y. So anyways, let's continue. All right.
But we should rely on the efforts of reason, the very slow empirical effort which finds in the city the conditions that make it possible, reason in the first principle of its development. Or in 273, THETHEORYOFFINITEMODES. Its initial aspect is the effort to organize encounters in such a way that we are affected by a maximum of joyful passions. For joyful passions increase our power of action. Reason is the power of understanding, the power of action belonging to the soul. So joyful passions agree with reason and lead us to understand, or determine us to become reasonable. But it is not enough for our power of action to increase. It might increase indefinitely. Joyful passions might follow indefinitely from joyful passions, without us coming into full possession of our power of action. A sum of passions does not make an action. It is not enough. Then, just to accumulate joyful passions, we must find the means, through such accumulation, to win the power of action, and so at last experience active affections of which we are the cause. The second principal question of the ethics is thus, what must we do to produce in ourselves active affections? 1. Active affections, when they occur, are necessarily joyful. There is no active sadness. Since all sadness is the diminution of our power of action, only joy can be active. 2. So if our power of action increases to the point that we come into its full possession, our subsequent affections will necessarily be active joys. 3. 2. Active joy is another feeling than passive joy. 4. And yet Spinoza suggests that the distinction between the two is one of reason only. The two feelings differ only in the causes. Passive joy is produced by an object that agrees with it.
Let me invite more people.
Active joy is another feeling than passive joy. Point 4. And yet Spinoza suggests that the distinction between the two is one of reason only. As the two feelings differ only in the causes. Passive joy is produced by an object that agrees with us, and whose power increases our power of action, but of which we do not yet have an adequate idea. Active joy we produce by ourselves. It flows from our power of action itself, follows from an adequate idea in us. 3. To the extent that passive joys increase our power of action, they agree with reason. But since reason is the soul's power of action, those joys that are active are born of reason. When Spinoza suggests that what agrees with reason may also be born. 274. Commonnotions. Of it, he means that from every passive joy there may arise an active joy distinguished from it only by its cause. Point 6. Consider two bodies that agree entirely. Two bodies, that is to say, all of whose relations can be combined. They are like parts of a whole, the whole exercising a general function in relation to these parts, and the parts having a common property as belonging to the whole. Thus two bodies that agree entirely have an identical structure, because all their relations may be combined. They have an analogy, similarity or community of composition. Now consider bodies agreeing less and less, or bodies opposed to one another. The constitutive relations can no longer be directly combined, but present such differences that any resemblance between the bodies appears to be excluded. There is still, however, a similarity or community of composition, but this from a more and more general viewpoint which, in the limit, brings nature as a whole into play. One must in fact take account of the whole formed by the two bodies, not with one another directly, but together with all the intermediary terms that allow us to pass from one to the other. As all relations are combined in nature as a whole, nature presents a similarity of composition that may be seen in all bodies from the most general viewpoint. One may pass from one body to another, however different, simply by changing the relation between its ultimate parts, for it is only relations that change in the universe as a whole, whose parts remain the same. We thus arrive at what Spinoza calls a common notion. A common notion is always an idea of a similarity of composition in existing modes. But there are different kinds of such notions. Spinoza says that common notions may be more or less useful, more or less easily formed, and also more or less universal. That 275 theoryouffinitemodes is, they are organized in terms of the greater or lesser generality of their viewpoints. 7. One may in fact distinguish two main varieties of common notion. The less universal, but also the most useful, are those representing a similarity of composition between bodies that directly agree, and this from their own viewpoint. One common notion, for example, represents what is common to a human body and to certain external bodies. 8. Through such notions we understand agreements between modes. They go beyond an external perception of agreements observed by chance, to find in a similarity of composition the necessary internal raison for an agreement of bodies. At the other extreme, the most universal common notions also represent a similarity or community of composition, but now between bodies that agree from a very general viewpoint, and not from their own viewpoint. They thus represent what is common to all things. For example, extension, or movement and rest, that is, the universal similarity of relations as combined ad infinitum from the viewpoint of nature as a whole. 9. These notions also have the use, for they allow us to understand disagreements themselves, giving us a necessary internal reason for them. In fact, they allow us to determine the viewpoint beyond which a very general agreement between two bodies ends. They show us how and why opposition appears when we adopt a less universal viewpoint on these same two bodies. We are able, by making an experiment in thought, To vary a relation upto the point where the corresponding body takes on a nature in some sense contrary to its own, we can thereby understand the nature of disagreements between bodies with these or those relations. Thus, when assigning a role to all common notions taken as a whole, Spinoza says they internally determine the mind to understand the agreements of things, as well as the differences and oppositions. Commonnotions. Spinoza carefully distinguishes common notions, on the one hand, and transcendental terms being thing, something, or universal notions genera and species, man, horse, dog on the other. One and yet common notions are themselves universal. More or less universal according to the degree of generality. One must then suppose that Spinoza is not attacking what is universal, but only a certain conception of abstract universality. Similarly, Spinoza is not criticizing the notions of genus and species in general. He himself speaks of horse and dog as natural types, of man himself as a normative type or model. J2 here again, we must suppose that he is attacking only a certain abstract determination of genera and species. An abstract idea has, indeed, two aspects that reflect its inadequacy. In the first place, it retains only gross sensible differences between things. We choose a sensible characteristic that is easily imagined. We distinguish objects possessing it from those that do not. We identify all those possessing it. As for minor differences, we pass over these, precisely because objects become confused once their number exceeds the capacity of our imagination. Second, a sensible differential characteristic is extremely variable. It is accidental, depending on the way objects affect each of us in chance encounters. Those who have often regarded men's stature with wonder will understand by the word man an animal of erect stature. But those who have been accustomed to consider some other characteristic will form another general image of men. For example, that man is an animal capable of laughter, or a featherless biped, or a rational animal. L3 and the kind of characteristic selected changes not only from individual to individual, but also among the different objects affecting the same individual. Certain objects are defined by the sensible form, others by the use or function, their manner of being, and so on. On all counts, abstract ideas are thoroughly inadequate. They are images that are not explained by 277. THETHEORYOFFINITEMODES. Our power of thinking, but that involved rather our impotence. Images that do not express the nature of things, but indicate rather the variability of our human constitution. In all this, Spinoza is clearly attacking not just the procedures of common sense, but the Aristotelian tradition also. The attempt to define genera and species through differences first appears in Aristotelian biology, and those sensible differences vary considerably in nature when different animals are in question. Against this tradition, Spinoza proposes a grand principle: to consider structures rather than sensible forms or functions. 14. But what is the meaning of structure? It is a system of relations between the parts of a body, these parts not being organs, but the anatomical components of those organs. By inquiring how these relations vary from one body to another, we have a way of directly determining the resemblances between two bodies, however disparate they may be. The form and function of an organ in a given animal depends solely on the relations between its organic parts, that is, between fixed anatomical components. In the limit, nature as a whole is a single animal in which only the relations between the parts vary. For the examination of sensible differences is substituted an examination of intelligible similarities, which allow us to understand resemblances and differences between bodies. From the inside E. Spinoza's common notions are biological, rather than physical or mathematical ideas. They really do play the part of ideas in a philosophy of nature from which all final ity has been excluded. Spinoza's comments on this aspect of common notions are indeed, rare. But then his comments on all aspects of common notions are rare. And we will see why. His suggestions nevertheless suffice to make him a forerunner of Geoffroy Saint Hilaire. In the development of the great principle of compositional unity, common notions are general rather than abstract ideas, and as commonnotions, such they are necessarily adequate. Take the case of the less universal notions. What is common to my body and to certain external bodies is equally in each of these bodies. The idea is thus present in God, not only insofar as he has an idea of those external bodies, but also insofar as he simply has the idea of my body. Thus I myself have the idea of something common to various bodies, and have it as it is in God. 16. As for the more universal notions, what is common to all things is equally in the part and in the whole. The idea is thus present in God, and so on. L7. These proofs underlie the two aspects in which common notions in general are necessarily adequate. In other words, common notions are ideas that are formally explained by our power of thinking and that, materially, express the idea of God as their efficient cause. They are explained by our power of thinking because, being in us as they are in God, they fall within our own power as they fall within the absolute power of God. They express the idea of God as the cause because, since God possesses them as we possess them, they necessarily involve God's essence. Indeed, when Spinoza says that all ideas of particular things necessarily involve the eternal infinite essence of God, he means particular things as they are in God, and so ideas of things as possessed by God. 18. Among the ideas we have, the only ones capable of expressing God's essence, or of involving knowledge of this essence, are thus ideas that are in us as they are in God. In short, common notions. 19. Several important consequences follow from this. 1. We were asking how we might attain adequate ideas. Everything about existence condemned us to having only inadequate ideas. We had ideas neither of ourselves, nor of external bodies, but only ideas of affections, indicating the effect of some external body on us. But precisely from such an effect, we can form the idea of what is common to some external body and our own. Given the conditions of our existence, this is for us the only possible way of 279. THETHEORYOFFINITEMODES. Reaching an adequate idea. The first adequate idea we have is a common notion, the idea of something common. 2. This idea is explained by our power of understanding or thinking. But the power of understanding is the soul's power of action. We are therefore active insofar as we form common notions. The forming of a common notion marks the point at which we enter into full possession of our power of action. It thereby constitutes the second stage of reason. Reason in its initial development is the effort to organize encounters on the basis of perceived agreements and disagreements. The very activity of reason is the effort to conceive common notions, and so to intellectually understand agreements and disagreements themselves. When we form a common notion, our soul is said to use reason. We come into the possession of our power of action or of understanding. We become reasonable beings. 3. A common notion is our first adequate idea. But whatever it be, it leads us directly to another adequate idea. An adequate idea is expressive, and what it expresses is the essence of God. Any common notion gives us direct knowledge of God's eternal infinite essence. Any adequate, that is to say, expressive idea, gives us knowledge of what it expresses. That is adequate knowledge of God's essence itself. There is, though, a danger of common notions appearing to intervene miraculously, unless we explain how we come to form them. How do they come to break the concatenation of inadequate ideas to which we had seemed condemned? Common does not of course mean merely something common to two or more bodies, but something common also to minds capable of forming an idea of it. Spinoza first of all reminds us that common notions can be more common or less common in different minds. 20, and even if they be identified with innate ideas. Innateness in no way does. 280. COMMONNOTIONS. Away with the effort of forming them. A causa gendi we need in order to rediscover what is already given only in principle. That common notions are in us as they are in God means only that. If we form them, we have them as God has them. But how, indeed, do we form them, in what favorable circumstances? How do we arrive at our power of action? As long as we retain a speculative viewpoint, the problem remains insoluble. There seems to be a danger of two mistaken interpretations of the theory of common notions, overlooking the biological sense in favor of their mathematical one. And, above all, overlooking the practical sense in favor of the speculative content. The latter mistake may be explained by the way Spinoza himself introduces his system of common notions. For Part 2 of the Ethics does indeed consider such notions from a purely speculative viewpoint, and therefore presents them in logical order, proceeding from the most universal to the least universal. 21. But there Spinoza is only showing that if we form common notions, they are necessarily adequate ideas. The cause and order of the formation is still unknown to us, as is the practical nature and function, which is merely suggested in Part 2p. It is true that all bodies have something in common, be it only extension and movement and rest. Bodies that do not agree and are opposed to one another have nevertheless something in common, namely a very general similarity of composite, and which brings into play nature as a whole under the attribute of extension. 23. This indeed is why the presentation of common notions in logical order begins with the most universal, then, with bodies very disparate one from another, and very opposed one to another. But if it be true that two opposed bodies have something in common, one can never, on the other hand, be opposed to the other or bad for the other through what it has in common with it. No thing can be evil through what it has in. 281. THETHEORYOFFINITEMODES. Common with our nature, but insofar as it is evil for us, it is contrary to us. 24. When we experience a bad affection, a sad passive affection produced in us by a body that disagrees with us, nothing induces us to form the idea of what is common to that body and our own. The opposite is the case when we experience a joyful affection, a thing being good to the extent that it agrees with our nature. The joyful affection itself induces us to form the corresponding common notion. The first common notions we form are thus the least universal. Those, that is, that apply to our body and to another that agrees directly with our own and affects it with joy. If we consider the order in which common notions are formed, we must begin from the least universal, for the most universal, applying to bodies opposed to our own, have no inductive principle in the affections we experience. In what sense are we here taking induce? What is in question is a kind of occasional cause. Our adequate ideas are formally explained by our power of understanding or action. But everything that is explained by our power of action depends only on our essence, and is thus innate, but innateness had already, in Descartes, involved a kind of occasionalism. What is innate is active, but it can only become actual if it finds a favorable occasion among affections that come from outside us. Among passive affections, Spinoza's scheme seems then to be as follows. When we encounter a body that agrees with our own, when we experience a joyful passive affection, we are induced to form the idea of what is common to that body and our own. Thus Spinoza is led, in Part 5 of the Ethics, to recognize the special part played by joyful passions in the formation of common notions, so long as we are not torn by feelings contrary to our nature, feelings of sadness, provoked by contrary objects that do not agree with us. The power of the mind by which it strives to understand things is not hindered. So long, then, the mind has. 282. commonnotions. The power of forming clear and distinct ideas. 25 It is enough, in fact, for the hindrance to be lifted, for the power of action to become actual, and for us to come into possession of what is innate in us. One can see why it was not enough us to accumulate joyful passions in order to become active. The passion of love is linked to the passion of joy, and other feelings and desires are linked to love. All increase our power of action, but never to the point that we become active. These feelings must first become secure. We must first of all avoid sad passions which diminish our power of action. This is reason's initial endeavor. But we must then break out of the mere concatenation of passions, even joyful ones, for these still do not give us possession of our power of action. We have no adequate idea of objects that agree in nature with us. Joyful passions are themselves born of inadequate ideas, which only indicate a body's effect on us. We must then, by the aid of joyful passions, form the idea of what is common to some external body and our own. For this idea alone, this common notion, is adequate. This is the second stage of reason. Then, and then only, do we understand and act. And we are reasonable, this not through the accumulation of joyful passions as passions, but by a genuine leap, which puts us in possession of an adequate idea. By the aid of such accumulation, why do we become active when we form a common notion or have an adequate idea? An adequate idea is explained by our power of understanding, and so by our power of action. It puts us in possession of this power, but how does it do this? We should remember that inadequate ideas also involve a concatenation of ideas that follow from them. A mind that forms an adequate idea is the adequate cause of the ideas that follow from it. This is the sense in which it is active. 26 What then are the ideas that follow from the common notion which we form by the aid of joyful passions? Joyful passions are ideas of the affections produced. Theoryoffinites. By a body that agrees with our own. Our mind by itself forms the idea of what is common to that body and our own. From this flows an idea of the affection, a feeling which is no longer passive but active. Such a feeling is no longer a passion, because it follows from an adequate idea in us. It is itself an adequate idea. It is distinct from the passive feeling from which we began, but distinct only in its cause. Its cause is no longer an inadequate idea of an object that agrees with us, but the necessarily adequate idea of what is common to that object and ourselves. Thus Spinoza can say, a feeling which is a passion ceases to be a passion as soon as we form a clear and distinct, adequate idea of it. 27 For we form a clear and distinct idea of it insofar as we attach it to the common notion as to its cause. It is then active, and dependent on our power of action. Spinoza does not mean that all passion disappears. What disappears is not the passive joy itself, but all the passions, all the desires linked to it and connected with the idea of the external thing, the passion of love. And so on. 28. Any feeling determines our conatus to do something on the basis of an idea of an object, conatus. Thus determined is called a desire. But as long as we are determined by a feeling of passive joy, our ideas are still irrational, since they are born of inadequate ideas. But as well as passive joy, we now have an active joy distinct only in its cause. From this active joy are born desires that belong to reason, since they proceed from an adequate idea. 29. All the appetites, or desires, are passions only insofar as they arise from inadequate ideas, and are counted as virtues when they are aroused or generated by adequate ideas. For all the desires by which we are determined to do something can arise as much from adequate ideas as from inadequate ones. 30 Desires of reason thus replace irrational desires, or rather, a rational concatenation of desires is substituted for an irrational one. We have the power commonnotions of ordering and connecting the affections of the body according G to the order of the understanding. 31. This whole process as described by Spinoza falls into 4 phases. 1. Passive joy, which increases our power of action, and from which flow desires and passions based on a still inadequate idea. 2. The formation, by the aid of these joyful passions, of a common notion and adequate idea. 3. Active joy, which follows from this common notion and is explained by our power of action. 4. This active joy is added to the passive joy, but replaces the passions of desire born of the latter by desires belonging to reason, which are genuine actions. Spinoza's project ECT is thus realized not by suppressing all passion, but by the aid of joyful passions restricting passions to the smallest part of ourselves, so that our capacity to be affected is exercised by a maximum of active affections. 32. Spinoza shows at the opening of Part 5 of the Ethics that a feeling ceases to be a passion once we form a clear and distinct adequate idea of it, and that we form a clear and distinct idea of it as soon as we attach it to a common notion as to its cause. Spinoza doesn't, however, apply this principle only to the feeling of joy, but asserts its applicability to any feeling. There is no affection of the body of which NE cannot form a clear and distinct concept. 33. The proof of this proposition is very concise. Those things that are common to all can only be conceived adequately. And so, quote, let us consider, then, the case of sadness. Spinoza obviously does not mean that sadness, being an inevitable passion, is itself common to all men or to all beings. He does not forget that a common notion is always the idea of something positive. Nothing is common through mere impotence or through imperfection. 34. Spinoza means that, even in the case of a body that does not agree with our own, and affects us with sadness, we can form an idea of what is common to that body and our theoryoffinites own. The common notion will simply be very universal, implying a much more general viewpoint than that of the two bodies confronting each other. It has nonetheless a practical function. It makes us understand why these two bodies in particular do not agree from their own viewpoint. We see that sadness over some good which has perished is lessened as soon as the man who has lost it realizes that this good could not, in any way, have been kept. 35. The man in fact understands that his own body and the external one could not have combined their relations in a durable way except in different circumstances, had there been intermediary terms, bringing into play the whole of nature, from whose viewpoint such a combination would have been possible. But when a very universal common notion makes us understand a disagreement, a feeling of active joy again flows from this, and active joy always follows from what we understand. Insofar as we understand the causes of sadness, it ceases to be a passion. 36. It thus appears that, even if we begin from a sad passion, the basic pattern of the earlier scheme is retained, sadness forming a common notion, active joy flowing from it. In Part 2 of the Ethics, Spinoza considers the speculative content of common notions. He supposes them given or potentially given. It is thus natural for him to proceed in a logical order from the most universal to the least universal. At the opening of Part 5 he analyzes the practical function of common notions. Supposed given, that function consists in such notions being the causes of adequate ideas of affections, that is, of active joys. The principle applies to the most universal common notions as to the least universal, and one can thus consider all common notions taken together. In the unity of the practical function, all is changed. Though, when Spinoza asks later in Part 5 how we come to form common notions, we who seem condemned to inadequate ideas and passions, we then see that our 286 COMMONNOTIONS initial notions are necessarily the least universal ones. They are those that apply to my body and another body that agrees, or some other bodies that agree with it. These alone have a chance of being formed from the passive joys I experience. The most universal, on the other hand, apply to all bodies, and so to very different bodies that are opposed to one another. But the sadness or opposition produced in us by a body that does not agree with our own never provides the occasion to form a common notion. So the process of forming common notions runs thus: we at first seek to experience a maximum of joyful passions, reason's initial endeavor. So we seek to avoid sad passions, to escape the concatenation and to avert bad encounters. We then, subsequently, use joyful passions to form corresponding common notions, whence flow active joys, the second effort of reason. These common notions are among the least universal, since they apply only to my body and to bodies that agree with it. But they strengthen our ability to avoid bad encounters, and above all they put us in possession of our power of action and understanding. Thus, third, we become capable of forming more universal common notions that apply in all cases. Even to bodies opposed to us, we become capable of understanding even our sadness, and of drawing from such understanding an active joy. We can cope with bad encounters which we cannot avoid, and reduce the sadness that necessarily remains with us. But it must not be forgotten that, despite the general identity of practical function, that of producing active joys, common notions are all the more useful, all the more effective, for being less universal, proceeding from joyful passions. Point 37. All common notions have the same speculative content, they involve a certain generality without abstraction. They all have the same practical function, as necessarily adequate ideas they are such that active joy necessarily flows from them. But they in no theoryoffinites way share the same speculative and practical roles, when one considers the conditions in which they are formed. The first common notions we form are the least universal, since the principle of their induction lies in our joyful passions. We come into our power of action on the level of the least universal, we accumulate passive joys, finding in them an opportunity to form common notions, from which flow active joys. The increase of our power of action thus presents us with the opportunity of coming into that power, or of becoming truly active. Having come into our true activity in some cases, we become capable of forming common notions even in less favorable cases. There is a whole learning process involved in common notions. In our becoming active, we should not overlook the importance in Spinozism of this formative process. We have to start from the least universal common notions. From the first we have a chance to form. 288. See.
Okay, well, that is chapter 17. Common notions. Common notions there are the answer to how a finite mode can become active, and about how we can go from being just kind of at the, just a victim of either the active passive or passive joys or sad passions that we experience, to moving to active joy and activity, adequate notions, adequate ideas. All of that is what he's talking about there, and the process that it goes through, and how reason is embedded in that as well. So we'll look at that again tonight in the group. There's links on Meetup, which will talk about that. So if you're not here this time, then you're welcome to join in the future for chapter 18 or whatever other ones you're going to look at. Generally, I'll just have these read aloud by my phone, and then I'll probably sometimes offer commentary if I get excited, or sometimes just sit and listen myself. Thank you.